So, in the spirit of respect and reciprocity and truth, we honor and acknowledge what we call the Halifax Regional Municipality is located in Mi'kma'ki, the ancestral, traditional, unsurrendered, unceded lands of the Mi'kmaq people. The territory that we live on or are visiting has been a home and a site of real relationality for the Mi'kmaq people for generations and generations and generations and generations. But of course, the peace and friendship treaties signed in this territory are meant to recognize that we are all, as it were, treaty people. We all have territorial acknowledgments to give, but also treaty obligations to live up to. And even doing this acknowledgement is really just like a minor step in that, and for many, many reasons that I'm sure we'll touch on. But yeah, we'll leave it at that. And feel free if you want to give your own territorial acknowledgement. It's often this like formality now. This is part of the reason I hesitate to sometimes do it. It should be almost more of like a conversation about territory, but at any rate. I wanted to start with this question of place today, right? The idea that when climate change, for example, hits, it's not just about like infrastructure or insurance or even ecology, but about all of those things kind of bound up into one sense of place, which is, very difficult to describe. So much of our art is like about looking for a way to capture that, I guess. And you seem to often sort of meditate on the transformation that takes place when people are out in the natural world, as it were, like forests, right? When they see damage, especially to different environments. We've talked about how people are close to the water that they drink, like they get their water from wells in huge numbers. It's clear that in Nova Scotia and elsewhere, like connection to place runs very deep in people. And I basically want to present this to you as a way of thinking about like whether that feeling of solastalgia, as it's sometimes called, or loss of place, can be fuel for the fire of localized movements for climate and I would say like energy justice. So, I mean, that's the general philosophical question, but it all grows out of some of the stuff that you've mentioned to me about how, folks, especially maybe in rural environments who are closer to nature, will talk about like getting lost in a place that's being transformed, by development, by industrial capitalism. Are they talking about their solastalgia from your perspective, or is it just about like shock, basically, at the pace of change that people are seeing?
It's interesting. I actually think they're talking about a physical experience of a change to relationship with the land. And the example I'll give, because it was the most striking to me, was when we were camped out down in Digby County trying to stop clear cutting in moose habitat. It was hunting season, and we were way back. We were, an hour's drive off Blacktop and Signal. Um, but what I didn't know about setting up camp like that in a really pretty remote place was that we would spend a huge amount of time sitting around the fire drinking coffee with hunters. That they would kind of come by, they'd say, "Hmm, you know that I eat meat, right? I mean, I hunt." And I'd say, "Yeah, I eat meat too. We raise sheep and eat them." Oh, okay. So having passed that hurdle, we would then sit down and have a cup of coffee. And pretty much every single one of those guys, and they were all guys, said, there was a place that I used to go and hunt, and my father hunted, my grandfather hunted. I've known it since I was a boy. And one fall I went back, and the forest was gone. It had been clear cut, and I got lost. And it was the tone of their voices when they said I got lost that it was so specific. It was so like I went to a place I knew like the back of my hand. That was the other phrase that they always used. And I got lost. And it really just went very deep into me what a profound experience that was of powerlessness in the face of industrial forestry, industrial capitalism, and what a robbery it was, and that they experienced it as a robbery. There wasn't much question about that. They were not fans of Irving and others who had come in, set up a mill, cleaned out the wood, took the mill down and moved it somewhere else. Like those were the classic temporary jobs. Now, were they going to join us on the camp? Probably not, but they helped us out. They told us things that were going on. They warned us that a gate was going to be put up to make it hard for us to move around. They came and gave us jerky and sausages. And so there was, real connection was built up through that. Because the other thing that they said, and it was a curious turn of phrase, maybe particular to Digby County, but they would say, I want you to know that I 100% support you. And I mean, I think that, the current government would be very surprised to know that that was the feeling between hunters and, quote, tree huggers.
No, yeah.
Out. But there was a real understanding that we were trying to protect something that really mattered to them.
Mm-hmm.
I think the other thing that I've seen very clearly in rural Nova Scotia is the legacy of, centuries of resource pillage, which is that people don't have a lot of hope that you can do anything about it. So they sort of viewed us as being these slightly surprising characters who thought that we could do something about it. And they wished us the very best, and they were willing to help somewhat. But I also think they just felt like, oh, the logging companies always win. So I think to me, that became a really important thought. It also happened when I first moved to Nova Scotia. I talked to an elderly guy up the road. We both loved plants and talked about wild plants. And at some point he said, they came and they took the fish, and they came and they took the forests, and now they want the rock from under my feet, and they'll get that too. And that was when they were trying to quarry the trap rock down on Digby Neck to send off to the US to make driveways. Well, actually, we won that fight. They were wrong about that. But to convince people that there is a reason to fight is part of why I do the stuff I do. And I think many of us do the stuff we do, which is to create some sense of that resistance is possible, that hope is possible, that, we don't define success as we're going to stop all clear cutting in Nova Scotia right now. Like this, you choose more available goals. It doesn't mean you don't have a long-term goal, but basically you try to do things that you might succeed at. Not that there are any guarantees. And, it's kind of amazing the number of people who have come up and thanked us when we're doing things. They're often afraid of consequences from the local large landowners. The guys in particular are kind of weenie because they want to keep their hunting rights. But it's much more complicated than, rural Nova Scotians are conservative and they want the logging jobs.
Right. No. And I think that leads into this next question that I had, which is more specifically about maybe the assumptions we have about like rural agrarian communities, that they're like behind the times or that they're conservative, like the meat eating, right? Like the meat eating is such a signpost that says like, are you one of us? Are you part of this community, or are you one of those like vegan, tree hugger, climate activists? It's helpful for me to think with you about like that problem of kind of like populism, what counts as populist in a given community, and sort of how we create bridges, if possible, between ourselves and those we perceive as other in this struggle, you know. Yeah, so I'm just managing some aspects of the Zoom here, making sure that everything's running all right. Uh, we've got, if folks could turn off their cameras, I think that would maybe be a good move at this point anyway. Which, you know, you should feel free to click them back on during the Q&A a little bit later on. I think we're good. But yeah, no, the feeling that I get is that on some level it is more complicated, like this fact that you kind of emphasized at the end, than just, you know, castigating, condemning, and sort of mischaracterizing an entire group of people as like somehow homogeneously conservative. The other part of it is that you've told me that you think it's not really wildly complicated to do the sort of organizing work that you're attempting to do, which involves demonstrating, but also you've said involves just like trying to bring people together for food to talk about stuff. You know, you say you told me that it's not wildly complicated. Basically, you have to offer connection rather than offer success. And so I wondered if you could speak to the kind of connection there between trying to move past this binary logic of success versus failure toward modes of quote unquote organizing that are really just about trying to give people a public space or just a healthy place to meet and connect outside of the market and with this kind of open invitation. Because I don't know, that's what moved me most in talking to you before this interview was like your instincts about what's not complicated about organizing for energy, environmental, climate justice.
Well, at the risk of seeming to go on talking about logging roads, but I'm going to because they're an interesting meeting place.
Mm-hmm.
Because essentially, if you put yourself out in a tent on a logging road, anybody who wants to talk to you can come and talk to you. You know,
Right.
you're pretty available. You don't have a lock on your front door. Um,
Yeah.
and that makes that, but it also makes you interesting because you're willing to sacrifice some level of comfort.
Mm-hmm.
And I think there's also respect for practicality. Like, oh, okay, you're managing to live through a winter in a tent. Huh, that's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I think rural people tend to have some respect for just like what it takes to physically survive and be
Sure.
okay and sort of not make a fuss about it. Um, so those are some of those places of common ground, just like the piece of common ground that is the sense of being robbed when forest is clear cut. And another of those places of common ground, and this is probably conservatism with a small c, is a lot of Nova Scotians grew up with woodlots, rural Nova Scotians grew up with woodlots, where the ethos was you took what you needed and you left it better for the next generation. And that knowledge, it really fuels the disgust people feel for clear cutting. Like clear cutting is profoundly offensive to people because it's so wasteful. It's not, we're not using the language of ecology and destruction. We're using the language of sort of household care. But I mean, ecology, it comes from household. Um, that's a really critical bonding place. And again, I think that the sort of practicalities are helpful there. Um, I do think that it's way better to meet in person when you can than it is to try to do stuff virtually. And I think in rural Nova Scotia, it maybe is actually easier. We have community halls that are still intact, and we very deliberately use community halls as the place to gather. I mean, they're cheap and available and lovely, but it's also a statement about, what we value and what we want to support. And those community halls are often, embedded very immediately in that neighborhood, but also, they're things that people know where they are and drive past and connect. Um, I mean, I'm not pretending that we have like the perfect great model to reach across class divides and all of those things. But I will say that, I'm a fairly visibly not terribly binary person. I'm very clear that I have a wife. I don't present as a straight woman. Um, and I never really sense any kind of discomfort with that. I and maybe I'm just also fairly sort of sturdily rural looking. And I long ago learned as a young lesbian that it was very hard, in fact, to tell country women whether they were straight or not, because the general sort of presentation was really different than a kind of urban femininity. But I mean, so, there are also these other intersections of places where people are comfortable or not comfortable. I mean, rural Nova Scotia is pretty amazing for sort of people's willingness to chat with each other, and so that once you start making those connections, then you can start trying to find what else it is that binds you. And usually it's things you love, it's things you care about. I think once you get onto opinions, it's always trickier. But if you can connect with, what you care about, and maybe it's excitement about having heard a bird, you know. I mean, it's interesting to me as part of Save Our Old Forests, where our basic idea was, have people do what they already love to do and figure out a way for it to be in the service of old forests. So you're not trying to be an activist. You're trying to be a great baker or a musician or a poet or a lichen hunter or whatever it is, and connect with other people and do those things and connect that to protecting the old forest, protecting the fabric of our world, our natural world.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I mean, it's kind of amazing. Like we have, in the winter we do soup Sundays, and there's a free soup that people make and volunteers make. A meat one, a vegan one, and a vegetarian one. And local bakeries donate bread, and we usually have some kind of talk. And sometimes they're, quite not esoteric, but the history of basically the history of fungi and the development of plants and fungi on the planet. It's not like the thing you would think might be the most popular, but really people show up, and it's been fairly consistently somewhere between 35 and 50 people over the last 3 years that we've done these. And people show up and we have lunch together. And, it's like I always ask, how many new people are here to SOOF? And there's always a showing of hands. And then we say, well, we're not going to tell you what SOOF's about. You got to sit at a table and ask people. Um, but, pretty soon you hear a kind of hubbub of voices and people connect, and then they stay for the talk
Mm-hmm.
and make what they can, make what they will of it. But what everybody says is, wow, it's a relief to be in this room. Now, to an
It's
extent,
a
that's the
relief.
relief of being with other people who also care about the natural world. But it's not the relief of being with your exact same people.
Mm.
It's the shared caring, I think, that is the bond there.
Yeah, and almost the sort of, I think, just to kind of, make a pitch for the overarching theme of this series, there's something about being in a room with people that aren't just like-minded or, homophilic, right? Love of the same, but instead being in a room where it's a little bit unpredictable what's going to happen.
Mhm.
Like you might meet somebody, you might hear a story, there's an excitement around the just improvisational quality of being able to like meet up with the public, to be part of
Mhm.
the public, basically to participate in some kind of real democracy. And this is something you've also spoken with me about, which is the ways in which, like, clearly, the system of jurisdictional control and sovereign rule that Canada uses to govern this country is struggling, as it is in many other places, right? Like we are seeing resurgent fascism worldwide, but we're also seeing this kind of, I like to think of it as like this garrisoned form of neoliberal capitalism that is looking inward at resources as a way to kind of hold off the collapse around them. And
Mm.
you've basically said that you think our elected officials are hiding right now within these colonial institutions, hoarding their privilege, I would say, and they don't really have an alternative vision of the future, which is why I think we derive hope from connection. It's like they're just going to keep taking. It's just this form
Mm.
of like a exploitation that will happen without end and without any meaningful opposition. What you talked about that I picked up on is like this idea that if we talk about the health of the commons with people in a way that's relatable, like the stuff that they care about is being, obviously eroded, plundered, extracted from, and in many cases, like irreparably destroyed, like trying to communicate with people that that is linked to other notions of the public, like libraries, like a knowledge commons, like education, like health itself, like trying to sort of shift us away from focusing on all of these individual pursuits. Like the pursuit of health, even, is like an individual pursuit. And then just like zoom out and be with a random group of people and try and like reflect on the health of the commons that we have and the ones that, we're kind of losing.
Mm.
Like where do you, I guess, like politically, where do you align in this moment is the question. Like, is democracy a thing, the kind of grassroots democracy that you participate in sort of trying to foster? Does that feel like the way toward some sort of eco-socialist, averting of the whole, neoliberal death pact that sees us destroying what's left of the environment for profit? There are, I think, glimmers of hope, but locally, I think we need, for me at least, bright lights like you to kind of point to these modes of organizing that are genuinely transformative.
So the whole business of the province failing to fund libraries adequately
Yeah.
has been really interesting because I've been going to all of the local demonstrations week after
Mm-hmm.
week, and often I sort of hold the mic and invite people to speak. And I've been just so moved and kind of stunned by the power of the stories that people tell about what the access to the resources of the library has meant to them, whether it was growing up poor in a non-academic family and having this sort of haven that allowed them to go on to university and eventually actually go off and become librarians, or you know I won't go into the stories, but it's been really beautiful to be part of the. I mean, I've lived in, outside of Middleton for what, 18 years. There's lots of people I hadn't met before in my nearest town. And now we all greet each other because we recognize each other because 50 of us at least show up pretty much every week. Um, and I went to the Middleton Town Council meeting because part of the funding stuff is getting the local towns and the counties to pony up to keep things going while we try to fight with the province. And it was actually it was kind of a beautiful meeting. There were 16 of the public there wanting to talk about libraries. And, there was the mayor who's actually just terrific. And her and, the town's CAO, CEO, who, was knowledgeable about the procedures that the democracy, that were required to do things and make amendments. But she didn't make a big deal about it, that she just made it possible. And then they changed the agenda around so that we could speak after they told us what the hell was going on. And it, I was really moved by what a good little moment of democracy it was. And it was very local, and it was so different to the experience of week after week sitting and standing outside of the MLA's office while he like doesn't come out and doesn't talk to people. And the one time we did get to go in and talk with him, his assistant was like, well, no, I mean, gatherings can turn violent. And we were looking at each other like, yeah, okay. I said, we look like pitchforks and Molotov cocktails, don't we? I mean, come on. It was, but the sort of the distance and the disrespect versus the more local version. And I'm not glorifying all forms of local government as they exist, but it really does end up making me think that we need um, maybe citizens' assemblies as a way of working and building from the ground up. Um, and for those who don't know, those are essentially assemblies that are chosen the way juries are chosen. It's called sortition. It was actually part of Athenian democracy. They felt like you got less concentration of power if you randomly selected citizens than if you allowed those who wanted power to apply for it. Um, so, sortition essentially means forming a citizens' assembly by inviting people to serve the way juries serve and then providing expert testimony of different kinds and seeing what people decide. And it's been a really remarkable process. I mean, that Ireland used it because they could not come to any way of dealing with gay marriage and abortion rights in this sort of historically Catholic country. And basically, citizens' assemblies came up with ways to deal with those things, which have resulted in legislation that enshrines abortion rights and gay marriage rights, in that country. Um, so I really don't know where to align myself politically on the bigger scale. Every time no, it's not fair, but in spite of knowing that Carney was a banker and a neoliberal, I still hoped that he was going to step up on climate. And what I've seen is so incredibly discouraging that I do really find myself thinking, boy, at least federal governments are so captured by the corporations, by oil and gas, that they seem incapable of stepping outside it. And even if it's not that, I think it's almost like they actually just really can't picture a world beyond capitalism. And that's that famous saying, it's easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. So I actually spend a fair bit of time these days trying to think about the end of capitalism, of what comes after. And I don't really mean after, I mean, what can we be developing now? Sort of within the collapsing system, because I don't think we can wait.
No, absolutely not. And I mean, that's again like so at the heart of what I want to talk about in general with this series is the sort of like what does that act of oppositional creation prefigure in terms of what comes next, right? The unpredictable emergence of some sort of alternative system, because the one that we have, as you say, does seem to be sleepwalking into complete collapse. And, the goal then has to be basically like systems change, economic systems change, and figuring out how to do that. Other movements, though, as you say, have done it in the past, and it's important to remember this is not the only one that's ever existed, and that also people are being confronted with in the air they breathe, in the sky above them, like the consequences of you know relinquishing so much power to corporations. I would say, to put it like just really crudely, right? Um, and you've talked about how it's a mistake in a lot of ways, either strategically or just philosophically, politically, to like wait for things to collapse in order to kind of exploit that moment to like wedge in, to push into place alternatives, these solutions that we know need to exist, right? Public control over things like food, for example, which would completely transform everything from deforestation to greenhouse gas emissions. Like, we know what the solutions sort of are. Is it like, why from your perspective is it a real mistake to think in terms of we'll just wait for it to fail and then supply some kind of revolutionary alternative?
Well, that's a complete denial of how catastrophic climate change is. I mean, I've actually been weirdly enough, I've been reading something put out in part by the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries in Britain, working with the University of Exeter. And actuaries are people who do risk assessment for things like pension funds. Like, can we do some risk assessments so you don't run the risk of running out of money when people retire 30 years from now? And it turns out the risk assessment is a really interesting deal. And essentially, what they're saying is a lot of climate prediction stuff. Once you've got the science that gives you the data, but what's being done with it, they're saying should actually be done by people who understand a lot about risk assessment. Because what's actually happening now is people only want to look at things that you can measure. So, like temperature change is reasonably measurable. Tipping points are really hard to predict and describe. So, it really messes with your model. So, just leave them out. And essentially, the Institute for Actuaries are going, you can't do that because you've got to look at the risk that's posed by, all the different things, tipping points, yes, collapsing, mass death, collapses of food systems, all of these things. So they end up in a place of saying, well, when we look at all these different risks and we actually factor in these things where, you can't be precise, but you still have to count them because they really matter, because they might be catastrophic. They're like, well, there's a pretty good chance that if we breach 3 degrees above industrial levels of temperature by 2050, we're looking at the death of 4 billion people on the planet, as in half the global population. Now, when The Guardian published an article about this a year and a bit ago, this was January 2025, it had a headline saying, study finds that global GDP may be reduced by 50% by 2070. And it was like, what about the 4 billion people? Like, what? I mean, it's so weird and kind of abstract what's being counted and what isn't. But I think most of us have a feeling that the people we thought were going to be keeping an eye and coming up with some solutions actually really aren't. And they're going, it's kind of too expensive for us to deal with the missions, so never mind, we'll deal with them later. And the rest of us are like, but droughts, but fires, but floods, but storms, but ecosystem collapse, holy shit. So I don't think we have the luxury of waiting, because I think we're already in a process that may be beyond our ability to change. I mean, certainly beyond our ability to change in lots of ways, but it may be moving very fast outside our ability to change. So when I think about, what, how does this go forward? I think, okay, basically we need people who are going to limit the damage, and we need people who are going to imagine a future that we want to go to, and we need people who are already building some of those structures now so we can test them out, see them, point to them. And that's sort of effectively building new structures inside the shell of the old. Because the other thing is that, revolutions that are based on the collapse of government have a tendency to end up with nasty men in power with guns. So ideally, we actually don't really want to go down that road. And, we already have an interesting model. The neoliberals wanted to get rid of sort of New Deal democratic socialism. And they set about at the end of the 1930s coming up with an intellectual structure to do this. And they built all sorts of institutions. And essentially, they had these ideas kind of kicking around for when the next bad crisis happened, which was really the end of the 1970s with stagflation, etc. And in that crisis, suddenly there were all these handy-dandy neoliberal ideas, which came swooping in with incredible speed and shifted how things were done. I mean, I happened to have been at university during that transition period and left for a year and come back, and it was as if there was a whole different world view operating. It was a really weird phase change experience. We could be headed to that in a better direction or worse, but we could be headed to that in a better direction now. So some of our job is to create to create alternatives that are available to reach for as the shit hits the fan. And that's not about waiting and sitting around. And also, most of us only have, we have whatever life we have to live. Are you going to sit around and despair and claim that you're waiting? No, you have to do the work and hope that the moment comes while you're still alive to help out. you know?
Yeah, that's amazing. Wow. There's a ton in what you just said. And really, that's the mic drop moment that we should like end on. I just have in my notes prefiguring an alternative. Abolition is a positive project. But also, because that's the idea. I think like that to me, in terms like thinking through what you're talking about, which is this kind of like visionary opening onto an alternative before the collapse, almost to kind of detoxify the exit from this system. Like where my mind goes is sort of thinking about, yeah, solidarity as a verb, imagination as a form of work. Like you're talking about how there are multiple disciplines and different roles and responsibilities that will need to be filled, in this future that we hope for, which is one of like low carbon joy, less consumption, less growth. Like I think, these are the stories that we need to tell more often. And they are obviously very starkly different from the stories of kind of like warrior like, smashing the state, that kind of particular radicalism that does imagine taking power violently, which often doesn't end well, as you mentioned. But it is topical, this question of political violence, and I wanted to maybe hit on this. I know this has just happened, so it's kind of a sensitive subject, but the premier of Nova Scotia, Tim Houston's motorcade, was encircled by demonstrators and his windshield was broken. From what I understand, though, the event, like, details are still coming out about the event. Like, Houston's motorcade seems to, like, have weaponized their vehicle, which is now a common thing. But what's interesting to me is Houston's office, of course, put out a statement very, very quickly, a polished PR video where he describes what happened to him just a couple of days ago as violence. That there's a difference between peaceful protest and what occurred to him, which he described as violence. And I don't even want to dispute semantically whether it's violence or not. I want to ask about the stuff we've chatted about, which is the history of sabotage in general. I mean, like, this is a spontaneous act. This is something that took place where the man's windshield was broken. No one was harmed. He had a huge phalanx of security. But the politically motivated violence, especially perpetrated by the left, has been a really sensitive subject, I would say, especially since Charlie Kirk in the United States, but also even before that with, Black Lives Matter protesters burning down police stations, right? Like, there was a shift when people also started talking about Gaza on the question of whether or not violence is justified in the face of the boot of oppression, right? Whether you see that, in a variety of different ways, that's fine. But there is space in my mind for these kind of aggressive tactics to achieve political objectives. Like, I don't disparage it. I'm not a person who sees political violence and scolds it wherever it happens. That to me is an elitist position. But, if panic and fear don't move people, is there a way in which something like a windshield being broken at least gets it into a CBC article that what is being disputed are things like the ability for Mi'kmaq folks to regulate their own cannabis sales, the province's plan to promote fracking and mining, and the need to observe treaty rights. Like, that came from the CBC article on this moment, right? Where are you prepared to go in terms of the escalation of tactics? And are you a person who would sort of condemn an act of political violence?
Hmm. There are certainly acts of political violence I would condemn. I don't think that what happened yesterday really, I mean, the violence, as far as I'm concerned, primarily was actually, and it wasn't a motorcade, it was one Toyota SUV there were two decoy ones around the side, which is where I was, so I didn't actually see what happened um, right when the windshield got broken. But essentially, they used that vehicle to try to push through a crowd of people, which is against standard operating procedures. It's everything that's written for the RCMP and security says, do not do this. Your first job is to de-escalate, reduce the tensions. Don't use the vehicle to try and open a way through. Like, there's no question about this. And the Civil Liberties Union is like, actually, this is probably against the law to do that. So whose violence? Is one of the first questions. And I mean, yeah, like I got home and 11 o'clock last night, I turned on CBC and it said, political violence is unusual in Canada, but in Nova Scotia, yada, yada. And it was like, I mean, so the problem is, you've got a media that's going to tend to define in terms of pretty much what the politicians want to say about it. It's not even, it's truly not clear whether or not somebody smashed the windshield, which is how it's described, or whether it shattered when somebody got up on top of the car. Why did somebody get up on top of the car? The story I was told was that somebody, as they drove forward, somebody was then on the ground in front of the car that was still moving and people were trying to stop it. That could be an alternate narrative. It may or may not be fully true. I really don't know. But I do know that the narrative that was immediately peddled from the premier's office and to an extent on CBC involved the choice of words like the windshield was smashed. It's like, no, it shattered. Did it shatter because the guy sat on top of the roof? It might have. Windshields are known to do these things. But that kind of reduces the drama of the story. So I don't love the story of what was a really beautiful and amazing demonstration, which gathered together lots of different people. The library groups were there, and so was fracking, and so was the anti-uranium mining, so were treaty rights, so were, the right to sell cannabis. And that got sort of precluded, except it didn't really. I mean, the truth is the protest was on the CBC national news at 11, and it was the first item. So, okay. A lot of people learned that Nova Scotia hasn't been funding libraries, is planning on fracking, doesn't respect Mi'kmaq treaty rights. And that Tim Houston has managed to frustrate a lot of people. So I don't feel like I personally have a right to tell Mi'kmaq folks how they should deal with the RCMP. They have a history of experience, as do African Nova Scotians. They have a history of experience that I, as a white person, don't have. And I'm not sure I've really got any right to talk about that. As an organizer, it's tricky, but that's the nature of what we're doing. And I mean, I just want to sort of flip back for a moment to when we're talking about trying to envision a way forward, the really crucial sort of paradigm shift in my mind is that we have to understand that we're a part of nature. We don't own nature. We're not separate. We don't have a right to exploit it when we're cutting off the limb we're sitting on. And guess what? The Mi'kmaq have, against all genocidal pressure, managed to preserve a cultural understanding and a spiritual understanding that all of nature is our relation. Nogama, and that we have so much to learn from that and to come up with in settler society with our own versions and experience of that. But that is a really big chunk of the way forward, and it's hugely important to me that we're working together. I mean, we've been part of organizing the Shoulder to Shoulder Rural Treaty People, which really, comes from a very gracious invitation from Mi'kmaq matriarchs to settlers to participate and work shoulder to shoulder under the treaties of peace and friendship. They're a very forgiving people, as you know. Um, So the ability to do that kind of work and to be part of the Peace and Friendship Medicine Trail that's being set up, that's about, a different relationship with our commons, Crown land, unceded land. I mean, circling back around to the commons. I realize I'm not really answering your question about political sabotage because I don't really know what the answer is there. I know that, there's been some history when we were camped out the last Hope Camp, which is about mm, close to Highway 10 in Annapolis County. I began to talk with a trapper and farmer who'd been there for 6 or 7 generations, and he talked about past sabotage that had happened when an attempt was put in to put a logging road in to access an area that is still relatively uncut and very rare in that area because there's been so much clear cutting. And essentially, somebody like set fire to the bridge that was being put in, and when it didn't work, he came back with a backhoe and pushed it in the stream. And he's subsequently died, and so his name can be named. But the this sort of brings us right back to Digby County and a certain amount of direct action. And no, people aren't talking about solastalgia. They're talking about, hey, wait a minute, I don't want you to wreck our land. I mean, uranium mining didn't happen in the Southwest in the 80s, partly because every time the uranium company sent in vehicles and equipment to explore, bad things happened to the equipment. And, it was local people who told me about that, just sort of in the parking lot in Weymouth when I was out there trying to get signal. So, I don't have it in me to say, oh my God, that's terrible. Because why is it worse to take down a bridge that's going to allow clear cutting old growth forest? Mm, you know.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, yeah, and the thing you said earlier about like shared feeling of being robbed, like that often needs to find expression, right? A shared feeling
Mhm.
of being robbed looks for an outlet, and I like that you point to the fact that in terms of trying to like build a movement to oppose some of the toxic aspects of the status quo, like it's tough when a part of your movement decides to escalate in this way that is giving expression, right, to that anger at being robbed, right, the world underneath you sort of destroyed. Yeah, I mean, like it makes sense that people would resort to that, but from your perspective, it's not particularly constructive. I guess maybe I could wager to say, but like that's not even. I like that ultimately you sort of abdicate as well and say like it's not up to me. I don't know why people insist in some ways on like having a philosophy of violence. It's perhaps about trying to find common ground. Ironically, like as you say, the event being part of the national news is ultimately probably going to benefit those in power because they have the most message discipline and the most access to messaging, right? Like Houston is perhaps going to benefit in the long run because I don't know. But that sounds very hopeless, and I don't want to end on that note. You said some beautiful things about the value of sort of indigenous cosmology and Mi'kmaq relationality. And, I thought maybe the last question I would ask would be related to the fact that, like, this series I've put together is, 5 people that are all, in fact, white settlers. Like, the people that I've invited as guests are just spontaneously pretty homogeneous as a group. And I've had to sort of, like, come to terms with the fact that that says something about my own positionality, right? And my complicity with the broken promises and disregarded treaties in Mi'kmaq. And so I'm hoping that the series can be a little bit of like a seminar on settler. There's a problem often in these spaces where settler identity becomes the main focus, and that's not the point. But at least to sort of like reflect as settlers on what our treaty obligations are, where we are looking to try and restore relationships, if at all, and are at least like trying to work in solidarity with those that
Mm.
have, taken care of the land for so long, right? Like undoing the damage we've already done while trying to open up this possibility of an indigenous resurgence. That's a long-winded way of getting into the question about like your links with indigenous rights groups and the kind of vision that a Mi'kmaq relationality when it comes to nature sort of opens up for you.
Well, I mean, I think the first thing I want to say is that given the history of, betrayal and oppression, building trust requires showing up. Like just showing up and showing
Mm-hmm,
up and
mm-hmm.
showing up and building connection. And there's no substitute for being in the same room or the same tent, or the same outside in the same demonstration in the cold or whatever it is. That, you know, that's how I build trust in people. Why wouldn't it be how somebody else builds trust in me that I show up? And I think that that's, as we do that, we build relationships. And they're human relationships. They're, oh, good, I'm glad to see you. Not everybody gets along in the same way. There are people you're gladder to see, and likewise. And so I mean, I think that's a really essential bit that can get lost in feeling sort of theoretical or anxious about everything, is just show up, be in the car, give somebody a ride, have a conversation during the ride. That's, that's there. And I mean, I think the other thing to say is like yesterday, actually, I gave somebody a ride back to the Annapolis Valley Bands Reserve. And at some point I said to her, so, what do you think about the NDP? I was curious. And she said, I really don't really think very much about your government. I'm focused on getting our chiefs to pay attention to what the matriarchs say and not sell us down the river, you know. And I went, huh, okay. That's like, that was a really just a helpful, straightforward point of view to say, the things that I'm thinking about are not the things that you're thinking about. And we can both be thinking about them. There's nothing wrong with me thinking about what I'm thinking about and you thinking about what you're thinking about. But we shouldn't sort of assume that there's going to be some easy convergence there, because there probably isn't. But in terms of the obligations we have under the treaties, my friend Sadie Beaton, who you're going to have on later, um, talks about it as a liberatory framework, that the treaties of peace and friendship are a liberatory framework. And I really love that. It's not about, you know, apologizing and making amends. I mean, we all need to do that. But it's actually a kind of freedom to get out of the sort of entrapment of the separated, isolated, you know, moralless in some ways system that we're in, and get back into something where, like, I think about stuff that Albert Marshall has said, and he says, nature has rights, humans have responsibilities. That's worth pondering. And he talks about our primary obligation is to make nature feel loved and protected. And that's not, I didn't get his phrasing quite right there, but wow, do I love that nudge to a different position. Um, and part of what I get to do is then sort of let that flower in me and connect with what I already feel and have known since I was a child, you know, because we also bring in our own understanding that we're a part of everything and that we're not separate from nature. I mean, I think as children, most of us have some inkling of that is then sort of bred out. Um, yeah, I don't know if that, I have a feeling I lost track of your question, but
No, I mean, you completely landed the plane, to use a very petrochemical kind of metaphor. You totally landed the plane. I think the idea, I hadn't heard this idea from Albert Marshall that like our responsibility is to make nature feel loved. For whatever reason, I immediately thought of my dog who has responsibly stayed asleep in the other room. and how, you know, caring for our companion species does feel like it does shape us, right? And I'm very personally very, I'm trying to stay, I'm dropping my pen. I'm trying to stay open to all of these ideas, but especially that one that, you know, we're not separate from nature. We're cutting off, as you said, the limb that we're sitting on. Yeah, that's a powerful place for us to conclude. So I'll just, you know, thank you for talking to me. I want to throw things to the audience in just a second, but just, you know, kudos to you for doing the work that you do and reflecting in the way that you have on one of these really critical things that we face, which is the question of how we can actually come together and move the impasse, like this, dislodge this impasse that we're in, and move more into what people describe as like an interregnum, where we're in the in between and we're trying to kind of, you know, foster yeah, a liberatory framework for ecology, especially. So yeah, thanks so much.
No, thank you very much, Scott. I'm delighted you're doing this series. I'm really looking forward to hearing the other ones.